This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Thank you. You've been amazing, Alfredo. I think we have to all applaud our support staff here from Fromm. They're just fantastic. And yes, if you haven't gotten enough of hearing my voice over the last 8 weeks and you want to join us in December, I'm going to talk about another of my great loves, Greek tragedy, in particular, two of the Oedipus plays, Oedipus Tyrannus and Oedipus at Colonus, and ways in which the exploration of those plays can help us examine some critical issues of our own time. So I'd love to see you there. And also, you all have been amazing about throwing out many suggestions for me of what to teach next. I can't do the winter session because I'm in New York teaching directing at Columbia, but I will try and do the spring. And so I'm really thinking about a combination of what many of you have asked about. Some of you are interested in the plays of Tom Stoppard. Some of you are interested in modernism more broadly, including Beckett and other writers like that. So I'm trying to put together something that will be interesting, and I'll keep you posted. As Alfredo said, this is our last class, so I'm going to work on celebration in the room, but I'm going to leave time to answer questions or thoughts either that you have about these two one-act plays or just what we've been talking about for this whole course about the work of Harold Pinter. So feel free to, as you have been throughout the class amazingly, to throw in your questions. And I know somebody's already asked you about Leopoldstadt. I think I am going to do it in Boston. I haven't found a taker in San Francisco yet. So, if you want to lobby the theaters in the Bay Area to do Leopoldstadt, I would do it in a heartbeat. It is that's Tom Stoppard's play, which is so sadly relevant right now about Judaism, 19th and 20th century, about assimilation versus Zionism, and about the horrors of the Holocaust. It's a really personal play to Tom Stoppard. It's beautiful. I would love to do it. It is very big and very expensive, and so it's a challenge. But if you have thoughts or whatever, keep that energy going. It would be amazing to do it in the Bay Area. So, celebration in the room. This double is very personally resonant to me because I worked so closely with Pinter on these plays and because they coincided strangely enough with 9/11. So I'll just sort of tell you the story of how I got involved with these plays. The Room was Pinter's first play, 1956. And I'm sure once you read it, you could feel its kinship with The Birthday Party. It has very similar thematic issues of woman kind of pattering around, rabbiting on about nothing, and her husband silently there, and her fear of being invaded, and then strangers coming into her silent room and sort of taking over. It also has a lot of echoes of The Caretaker. But it was his very first play in his 20s that he wrote as a one-act. Many, many, many years later, in the year 2000, Pinter wrote a scabrous one-act, really vicious kind of farcical comedy called Celebration. And it was his idea to put the plays together on a double bill. They're each about an hour long. And he directed them at the Almeida in Celebration's premiere in London, which I didn't see, but shortly after their run in London, I had lunch, as I always did with Pinter when I went to London. We had lunch at La Caprice, and lunch with Pinter was always a kind of fabulous event. First of all, he could drink more than, anybody, and still, it's like watching Robert drink Corvo Bianco, the clip I showed you of from Betrayal. Pinter could drink like that at lunch and stay completely lucid. So I could never keep up with him. But the conversation always got more and more interesting as the lunch went along. And sort of halfway through the lunch, he said to me in his great baritone voice, "I have a play for you, and it's called Celebration, and I'd love you to do it." And he told me about this play, and I'll read you a couple of things. This is from my book, actually, about that lunch, because he described the play to me in great relish. He recited by heart quite a few speeches from the play that he knew. When I asked what these characters sounded like, he quickly replied, "I don't know what you call their particular accent, but I do know they all enjoy words and using words. They love it, and that's it." Then he grinned. One also has to remember, of course, and this is all a question of balance and degree, that they're all very drunk. And I listened to him describe the sort of crudity of his character speech. And I asked him a question about the waiter, and we'll talk about the waiter in great length in a minute. And I said, "Is he making it all up?" And Harold said, "I think he is. He's a wonderful improviser, isn't he? But I think that the crucial point is that the waiter himself is in love with literature." So here was another example of many of the things we've talked about in the last 2 months about this playwright's enormous love of great literature of T.S. Eliot and Yeats and all the great Pope and Dryden and the Jacobean dramatists, and of course Shakespeare, and how that comes up even in a vicious play about gun-running consultants who wreak violence around the world. There is a character who loves literature and keeps that alive. So I had decided that we would do these two plays, Celebration in the Room, on a double bill as the opening of our 2001-2002 season. And indeed, the preview was September the 13th, so 9/13/2001. Pinter was going to join us with Lady Antonia Fraser, and we had created a whole series of events around the work. We were doing lots of productions that our students had created. We were going to do an onstage discussion between me and Pinter about his work, all kinds of other things. And then came 9/11. And it was, as you will well remember, just absolute chaos all around. No, it was rather horribly resonant of October 7th for Israel when Hamas murdered 1,400 people. It was sort of this feeling of what do we do now? We were in previews, and several of our actors were New Yorkers, and we spent most of our days calling friends and family in New York to see if they were safe and where they were. And then I got this remarkable letter from Pinter, which I'll just quote a piece of. "The atrocities last week were totally appalling, and I'm aware of the depth of suffering on the part of many people, which will never go away. But I'm very concerned about the gung-ho rhetoric which has ensued at government level. As you know, I've always been highly critical of the U.S. government's policies and actions. My presence in the U.S. in the present climate would seem to me a very odd presence indeed. I think it would be hypocritical, impossible to sustain." Which seemed absolutely genuine to me and fair. He then went on to write the most beautiful statement to the actors about how grateful he was for their participation in his work and how he wished them a wonderful run, and that it seemed really important that the plays continue because of what they stood for, and because making theater is always, as he said, better than not making theater. So he didn't come. I felt his stance was completely consistent and clear with what he felt about American foreign policy at that time, and particularly about, the jingoism that he had witnessed in the Bush administration. I think, if nothing else, one of the things we've really looked at in this class was Pinter's hatred of cliche and jingoism and kind of political cant, and the way he exposes that at every level, and it comes up over and over again in Celebration. And so one may not have agreed with his political stance, but I do think what I always admired about Pinter was his complete honesty about where he stood and his total lack of hypocrisy about that. So we decided, we had many, many debates internally about, should we do these plays and should we be doing them at that moment in American history? But we decided that we would do them, and the first preview was September 13th. And we were very trepidatious about this night. And frankly, I didn't know if anybody would come. And I stood on stage to give a curtain speech on the Geary stage the night of September 13th. And And it was the most incredible experience I've ever had in the theater. The theater was packed. The audience looked very anxious, but also very eager to be there. I just asked everybody to take a moment and look down the aisle and recognize the people that were there, and that we had come together as a community, feeling many different feelings, I was sure, at that moment, but that we were there to celebrate a work of the imagination and to be together, and that was incredibly meaningful. So then the evening started with The Room, which is a very frightening play about terror. And, one of the humbling and interesting things about literary history in general, and certainly theater, is that how it changes over time. And when The Room and The Birthday Party and early Pinter, as I've told you many times now, was first produced, everybody said, what does this mean, right? We don't understand what it means. It's so peculiar. Who are these people? Why are they knocking on the door? Martin Esslin in Theatre of the Absurd labeled it all absurd. And Pinter kept saying they're not absurd, it's realism. Well, I will tell you that on 9/11 or 9/13, when Rose is sitting there, the heroine of this play, obviously in this tiny little room, terrified that there is some inchoate danger outside that she cannot name, but she feels. And her violent, big brute of a husband is sitting there eating his eggs. And he refuses to speak to her, and then gets up and slams out the door. And then a knock, she opens the door, and these strangers are waiting to intrude. Nobody in the audience had to be told what that emotion was, or why Rose was terrified, or indeed, it didn't matter in a literal sense who Mr. and Mrs. Sands were, who were knocking on the door, or indeed who Riley, the blind Black man that probably was inspired by T.S. Eliot's The Cocktail Party, who he was down there. It was a play about the way in which in this world nobody ever feels safe wherever you go, because terror is lurking and the knock on the door could come at any moment. And frankly, in the opening minutes of The Room, when we did it on September 13th, I was sitting there, backstage thinking, this is not a good idea. This is a really frightening play. This is really disturbing. The intermission was dead quiet, and I sort of went and said hello to people and asked how everybody was and everything. And then we started celebration. And as Peter Riegert said, it was one of the most amazing sounds I've ever heard in the theater. It starts with this obnoxious, who's having the duck? And there's Lambert saying, the duck's for me. Oh, it's also Bucco. And these vulgar men are arguing, and the laughter was so loud. Riegert said it was like people breathed again for the first time in 3 days. That audience needed to be in that room, in that theater, in a way that I've never heard an audience before or since. It was really kind of extraordinary and really moving. And it sort of, I would say, just reminded us all of why it matters to make theater. And it also reminded me, never underestimate an audience. And also, you can never get ahead of the zeitgeist. That great plays remain great plays because at their core, they have a metaphor that is resonant enough. And this is what I want to talk about when I talk in December about why I don't believe the classics should be canceled. I think that any great play resonates very differently at different moments in our history. And we always bring ourselves to, the moment and to the interpretation of plays. And so, so that was kind of a remarkable event for me in my creative life, and reminded me of why, for me, Pinter has always been so central to almost every significant event in my life and theatrical discovery. The fact that we put these two plays together, that we did them in rep, was also really important to me. This was a celebration of ACT's core company, which we had just created, and a celebration of my belief in actor transformation, and that the most interesting thing for an audience going to the theater is not to see television realism that you could better sit at home on your couches and watch on Netflix, but to watch actors transform. And so indeed, it was very tricky, and Pinter loved having dialogue with me about how each actor was going to double, and we doubled some of them in the same way, like Rose played Prue in Celebration, but in other ways, Marco Baricelli, who played Bert, played Matt instead of Lambert. We changed it all around, depending on who our company was. And the great Jewish actor Peter Riegert had to play Mr. Kidd in the room because he had played Goldberg for me in The Birthday Party. And so he then played Lambert in Celebration. And so Pinter and I spent many months on the phone, sort of discussing how the whole thing would work. For minute details, I will tell you, and I hope you've realized this by now, that one of the things I love so much about Pinter is what a man of the theater he was. These plays are plays meant to be performed, not just meant to be read. And he was intimately involved in their execution, like how do you do the drum in The Birthday Party? How do you score a newspaper so that the pages will rip in completely even 5 strips? And in this case, for example, how does the actress who's playing Rose end up playing Prue? So Lindsay Duncan played it for him, and she had this turban on to look like this poor woman in her bedsit. And then the turban came off at intermission, and there was Lindsay Duncan in a head full of blonde curls. So Pinter loved to solve practical problems. He'd been an actor all his life in repertory theater, so he knew exactly what it took. These are very hard plays to design in rep because they're radically different in tone and in class. So the room is a very constricted, very working class room. It has one exit upstage in a kind of tawdry room where there's one window and sort of milky winter light coming through. Again, as we've noticed, the chair in each room is always somebody's throne. As you will remember from No Man's Land, Hearst's armchair is Hearst's armchair. When he sits, it's a locus of power. In this case, it's Rose's rocking chair. And the fact that it's a rocking chair, right? And that it moves like this, that it's not an armchair, but something that keeps her anxiety at bay, but also a rocking chair. Remember that, what do people use rocking chairs for? Old people rocking them, but also mothers rocking them to nurse their children. So it's something that's obviously been inherited. And when Mr. Kidd looks at that chair and says, I recognize that chair. Where's that chair? We realize again, it's a colonized space in some way, that Rose isn't safe there, and she's not sure that she actually belongs there. When you travel then to Celebration, you're in this very upscale restaurant. It might be the Ivy in London. If you've ever been to the Ivy, that's a favorite in Covent Garden of Pinter's, or was a favorite of Pinter's. Also, Le Caprice was a favorite. So these very fancy restaurants, but again, there's a kind of imprisonment. But instead of it being a little room, these characters are imprisoned in banquettes. Those leather banquettes. I mean, you sit in them in Chinese restaurants, but in this case, it's a very fancy restaurant. But even so, the characters are trapped. So the 2 couples are entrapped that are celebrating the wedding anniversary in one banquette. That's table 1. And at table 2, Russell and Suki are entrapped in the other banquette. And just to get out requires a whole scrambling of how everybody is seated there. And Pinter really knew what it felt like to sit in there and what that entrapment was like. And the people that navigate through the middle are Richard, who is the, sort of maitre d', and Suki, who is the kind of elegant maîtresse d'hôtel. They navigate in between, and the waiter. So they're like these 2 islands of rich people, and then the people who navigate between them. And I designed a back wall that at the end could actually be lit through. So if you imagine, it was the wall in my set was made of scrim, which is just a kind of cloth. And the idea was at the very end of Celebration, when the waiter says, I'd like to make one more interjection, that the whole back wall was lit through. So it just disappeared. You didn't realize you were in a restaurant anymore. You were alone in the world with this mad waiter talking about his grandfather's history. So it was a very interesting challenge to design. But sort of fascinating to put together. As I say, I cast it such that my core company could carry the lead in this. And I want to share with you, I'm going to move forward in this and then back. You will remember, I hope, Marco Baricelli here from our core company at ACT, and the wonderful Stephen Anthony Jones, who played Riley and Bert. And then here is Gregory Wallace. Let's see if you can see this upper. Oh, this didn't come out very well. I don't know if you can see the whole image, but this is Gregory on top as the waiter, and actually this is Gregory down below as the as Gogo in Godot, which we also did not that long after we did Celebration. But I wanted you to see our company so you would remember these wonderful actors. And I also wanted you to hear a little clip, and then we're going to talk about Celebration. Well, let me actually, I'm going to stay with Celebration. Then we'll go back to The Room. So here is Celebration. This is a film that was made in 2007, so many years after the original production by the BBC. It has some wonderful things in it. It has some things that I would do differently, let's say, or I did do very differently. In particular, I interpreted the waiter very differently. So we can talk about that, because one of the interesting things about directing is there's no right answer. You have to really decide how you're going to approach and interpret any given moment of the text. And so it was interesting to me to see how they went about doing it in the film. But I wanted to just start with, so Celebration is a play about this couple, this kind of vile couple of two kind of rich arms dealer types who are celebrating the wedding anniversary of Lambert and Prue. And the other couple is Matt and Julie, and Prue and Julie are brother and sister, and Lambert and Matt are, Prue and Julie are sisters, and Lambert and Matt are brothers. So there's this weird family dynamic that goes on between these people, between these couples, and they're here to celebrate the anniversary. Again, a theme in Pinter comes up over and over again. Food, right, is always really important. Let's remember Meg when she was serving fried bread and cornflakes to Petey. In that case, it was a demonstration of love, right, and connection to Petey. And when Meg runs out of cornflakes, she is in a nameless state of panic because cornflakes are the only way that she holds her marriage together. In this case, food is a way to demonstrate power, wealth, control, with these extraordinarily emotionally bankrupt characters who are totally insincere and completely full of cliches. And you sort of feel greed has replaced personality on every level. So it starts with a classic Pinter line, who's having the duck? Now, much later, when Pinter wrote One for the Road, which is a one act I really urge you to read at some point, and when we did Mountain Language with him, which is also a very beautiful play, we sat in the room with him in New York, and he described why he thought in the English language the word fuck was so important. And it's the sound of it, that open O. He demonstrated it many times, fuck. And the K, he said it's explosive and it makes you, it sort of really wakes you up, and the use of it should be very precise, not gratuitous. Now, of course, David Mamet is a playwright very famous for using expletives in anything and using the word fuck over and over and over again. But yes, there is something that they are arms dealers. I'll explain to you how I got to that when they talk about guns later on. And I will also talk about the Jewish thread. Thank you very much, Ernest, for reminding me about that for the waiter, because the Jewish thread is going to keep coming up in these plays. It never goes away for Pinter. But so who's having the duck is such an amazing way to start, this kind of aggressive statement. And right away, Lambert, who's the most territorial and violent of the businessmen, claims it. The duck's for me. And Julie says, no, it isn't. And he says, no, it isn't. Who's it for? And Julie says, me. So that's his wife. What am I having? I thought I was having the duck. That duck's for me. Then Matt tries to diffuse. He always does. Chicken for my wife, steak for me. The waiter is relieved. Chicken for the lady. Prue says, thank you so much. And who's having the steak? Me. He pours the wine. Lambert is on the lamb, as it were. And for me, what about me? What did I order? And Julie says, who cares? She's so mean to him and he's so rude to her that when you find out it's their wedding anniversary, you simply can't believe that that's what we're celebrating now. He says, who cares? I bloody care. And one of the things you see is that classic Pinter thing that the man who seems the most full of testosterone, the most aggressive, the most violent, is the one who is neediest and most in need of attention. And Prue says, also buco. And here you get Pinter's classic play on words. Also what? Buco. It's an old Italian dish, explains Matt. So Lambert says vulgarly, well, I knew also was Italian, but I know bugger all about buco. And Matt says, I didn't know asshole was Italian. And Lambert riffs on that. Yes, but on the other hand, what's Italian for asshole? It's so rude. And then suddenly Prue says, Julie, Lambert, happy anniversary. Cheers. So it's sort of a perfect little encapsulation, of how Pinter mocks the cliches of civilized behavior with this undercurrent of incredible violence and hatred and nastiness. And those cliches come up over and over again. The next one is Russell and Suki. So Russell's a banker, Suki is his wife, but clearly he's just had an affair with the secretary and she's furious. And that's what you find out as their scene goes along. And so even to start it by saying they believe in me, the play questions whether anybody has any belief about anything. And he starts to defend his behavior by saying, listen, she was a secretary, that's all. Nothing else matters, in this totally misogynistic and obnoxious way. And she will not let him let go. And she goes on at great length about her own sexuality in a way that totally undermines him. And you think, what kind of really terrible relationship is this? That relationship. And the play bounces back and forth between the two couples as it gets more and more we expose more and more the completely morally bankrupt, but sort of needy and desperate quality of those families. And you start to hear the two tables overlap, but you start to hear how a theme that comes up over and over again, particularly in the Homecoming, about how sons never love their mothers. And then they say mothers only want to fuck their sons. Then they go into that whole riff, but you realize that they have no real relationship with their children. It's very heartbreaking that their children aren't there for their anniversary and clearly don't care, nor do they remember anything. They've been to a play. No, the ballet. What was it? That's a fucking good question. They can't even remember where they were the night before. The tension goes up and up and up. And it gets more and more hypocritical. So Suki starts telling Russell how proud she is of him, and she isn't, and she's ready to kneecap him completely. And then I wanted to play for you. I'm going to show you a couple of things before that. Well, let me get to first the section about the waiter, because I think if the waiter were not in the play, I feel it would be a satire of such unrelenting nastiness and corruption that you would sort of ultimately say, who cares? And I know some of you have felt that way, and you've written that in the chat about other, of these Pinter plays. You sort of think, well, there's such obnoxious people. Why should we care? What do we care about them at all? But into the mix of this comes this kind of not just remarkable, but heartfelt and beautiful, beautifully wrought waiter who, and Pinter told a wonderful story about how he dreamed that up, that I thought I'd share with you, because it tells you that in some way, this is the character that he identified with. When I was at lunch with him, he asked me if I'd ever been a waitress, and I told him all about my long and extensive waitress career, including my worked time as a waitress in Palo Alto when I was a student at Stanford, and he thought that was very funny. And then he said, I was a waiter. This has been a long career, you know. And he said the following: I was out of work as an actor, so I did a bit of waiting at the National Liberal Club. It's a fitness club in London. This was the early 1950s. I actually heard two men having lunch and talking about Kafka and the publication date of The Trial and the Castle. I stopped at the table and said, no, The Trial was published in 1922, or whatever the date was. And they said, really, was it? We thought it was later than that. I said, no, you'll find that I'm right. And I went back to the kitchen and was fired on the spot for talking to the customers. That was my experience as a waiter. So in a sense, I think the waiter in Celebration may have come from that. And what is beautiful about the waiter is that he has a sort of vast imagination, unlike anybody else in the play. And he is longing all the time for human connection. And when he can't find the human connection in the flesh, he conjures it in these capacious fantasies that link him to great minds and great moments from the past. Like Rose that we're going to find in the room, like Stanley in the birthday party, the waiter lives in terror of being ejected from the one place where he's left in peace and which he loves, which is this restaurant. So when Russell asks him about the restaurant, are you going to stay until it changes hands? The waiter kind of panics and says, are you suggesting I'm about to get the boot? To be brutally honest, I don't think I'd recover if they did a thing like that. This place is like a womb to me. I prefer to stay in my womb. I'd strongly prefer it to being born. And Russell replies, I don't blame you. And then he says, listen, next time we're talking about T.S. Eliot, I'll drop you a card. And the waiter says, you'd make me a very happy man. Thank you, thank you. So fantasy to the waiter is salvation. Memory is incredibly important. And the theme that we have seen now many, many times in Pinter, in which memory is kind of always not only uncertain, but useful to either weaponize the past or save the past, is a theme that comes up very, very strongly in both the room and in Celebration. So in this case, the waiter conjures this kind of magical past to give his presence some meaning. And as he does so, he starts to come up with even more and more kind of violent memories until you start to see images of the Holocaust, and you wonder if those deeply deep set memories of the Gestapo and the war are there for Pinter in the waiter as well. But it starts the waiter with him saying, I heard you talking about T.S. Eliot a little bit earlier this evening, and I thought you might be interested to know that my grandfather knew T.S. Eliot quite well. I'm not claiming he was a close friend of his, but he was damn sight more than a middling acquaintance. And there's something so beautiful about that, because it goes back to all of the things that we've seen in Pinter and other plays, particularly his love of literature and his belief that writers like Eliot sort of conjured for him in poetry like the Four Quartets and The Wasteland and the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, a universe of unbelievably complex post-war despair and humanity that Pinter himself wanted to evoke in his plays. So Eliot coming up, Yeats coming up, as we saw in Betrayal. These are all things that never left him and are going to come up again in over and over again in Celebration. The other thing that comes up, of course, are characters who are desperately holding on to golden memories of their own past. And I want to play you a section of Celebration, which even the most violent and vile character has a memory of a kind of golden time. So here that's Russell and Suki.
What a nice young man.
You won't believe this. You're not going to believe this. And I'm only saying this because I'm among friends. And I know I'm well liked because I trust my family and my friends. Because I know they like me fundamentally. You know, deep down they trust me, deep down they respect me. Otherwise, I wouldn't say this. I wouldn't take you all into my confidence if I thought you all hated my guts. I couldn't be open and frank with you if I thought you thought I was a pile of shit. If I thought you'd like to see me hung, drawn and fucking quartered, I couldn't be honest and straight with you if I thought that was the truth. Never. But as I was about to say, now, you won't believe this. I fell in love once. And this girl I fell in love with loved me back. I know she did.
Wasn't that me, darling?
Who?
Her.
No, not her, a girl. I used to take her for walks along the river.
Lambert fell in love with me on the top of a bus. It was a short journey. Fulham Broadway to Shepherd's Bush, but it was enough. He was trembling all over. I remember. When I got home, I came and sat on your bed, didn't I?
I used to take this girl for walks along the river. I was young. I wasn't much more than a nipper.
That's funny, I never knew anything about that. And I knew you quite well, didn't I?
What do you mean you knew me quite well? You knew nothing about me. You know nothing about me. Who the fuck are you, anyway?
I'm your big brother.
I'm talking about love, mate, you know, real fucking love.
So this is full of all of the amazing thematic things that we've been exploring in this entire class. But, you know, Lambert, this violent, rich, vulgar businessman, holds on to this golden memory of a first love as a kind of survival mechanism. At the very moment that he's having a wedding anniversary with the woman he married, about whom this love story is not. So it's hilarious and sort of shocking, but also horrifying, the way that he uses the past to try and justify his own present existence and sort of decimate the woman who's sitting right across from him. It also shows you the profound loneliness, and we talked about this a lot when we were looking at No Man's Land, that in a sense, one of the things that Pinter's plays are always about is no matter how much there is a lexicon of caring, and here's this man saying, I'm only saying this because I'm among friends, and clearly look at the quality of that friendship with friends like those who need enemies, right? But that ultimately everybody is sort of completely alone. And he looks at his own brother and says, you know nothing about me. Who the fuck are you anyway? So, and that just gets worse and worse as the play goes along. And they talk in sad terms about the children who remember nothing. And the counterpoint to this cliche is Richard, who the restaurant owner. And what's so creepy, and we've all been in this position in restaurants, is that he's a very elegant man and very gracious. And the class distinction and the kind of who pays who for what is so frightening in this play. Richard has to watch people behave in ways that you would not tolerate on a city bus if it were there, but he has to, and he has to be nice about it because they have money and they can pay. Good evening, everything in order, first class, I'm so glad, and all of that. And he has to pretend that these monsters sitting at the table are actually civilized people rather than the kind of horrors that they are, and and pretend that there's something intangible. He says that he's part of this atmosphere in the restaurant. He says it was evoked by his father's pub and his childhood memories, and the concept of this restaurant rests in the public house of my childhood and things like that. And it's kind of the way he has to navigate, and the way the maîtresse d'hôtel has to navigate the behavior of these thugs is kind of terrifying, but they have to, because that's the deal. They're not allowed to say, please don't behave that way in my restaurant. It's interesting in the film that Sonia is cast as a Black actress, and she's a very brilliant actress whom I just saw in London playing Medea. In our production, we cast Gregory Wallace as the waiter, and that was really interesting to have as the only Black actor in the restaurant. This Black waiter, it gave Gregory a kind of remarkable kind of independence of spirit in the world of this company, and really lifted the role of the waiter and as the anchor of this universe. The waiter gets kind of wilder and wilder as he starts to talk about Hollywood and love and history and things like that, and Hollywood movie stars. And here's where it comes, this thing of the Irish mafia in Hollywood. And then he says this crazy joke about Al Capone, Victor Mature, for example, they were both Irish. And you think, wait a minute, Al Capone? I don't think so. Victor Mature, no. And then there was John Dillinger, the celebrated gangster, and Gary Cooper, the celebrated film star. They were Jewish. So you think, wait a minute. What is he talking about? He gets all of the attributions backwards. But what he is really talking about is fantasy and hiding. So obviously one of the things about 30s and 40s Hollywood, right? And let us remember that that's a period Pinter loved very much. And all the songs from old times that I played for you are songs from that era. Lovely to Look At, Delightful to Know, all the Cole Porter songs, all of those things, right? Are a period in Hollywood and in popular music in which fantasy plays a very large role. Irving Berlin, most famous German Jewish composer, writes I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, right? Many Jews in Hollywood change their names and become glamorous, seemingly deracinated stars, but their Jewishness lies at the heart of who they are. And I think that's incredibly important to this play. People are all in hiding. And Pinter really knew what it was to change your name. We've talked about name changing a lot. To hide from the Gestapo. When we're going to get to the end of The Room, and Riley says to Rose, "Come home, Sal." And she says, "Don't call me that." You think, oh my God, is she Sarah? That's a Jewish name. Has she changed her name? Who is she in hiding from? Is she in hiding from anti-Semitism? It's really disturbing to me to read these right now as we're looking at the explosion of anti-Semitism around the world in a way that I never thought we would see again. And that thing about why Jews have always had to go in hiding and protect themselves and protect their names, and why fantasy and art and the imagination are ways for people who are under attack to protect themselves and hide. And The Waiter, I think, is emblematic of that. Okay. Then in the middle of celebration, the two tables fuse when we realize that Lambert knows Suki, and that probably Suki is the woman that he was in love with and had this affair with way back when. And it gets very dangerous because Russell, her husband, the banker, is terrified that he's going to lose Suki. And Julie, who is Lambert's wife, is totally aware right away that there's infidelity going on here. So I want you to watch this sort of amazing series of language as daggers where everybody tries to kind of eviscerate each other, and Lambert and Suki are in the middle enjoying their reunion. Okay.
Gary Cooper, the celebrated film star.
This is the end of The Waiter.
They were Jewish.
And here's the banquet of table 1.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does make you think.
See that girl at that table? I know her. I fucked her when she was 18.
What, by the banks of the river?
He says at his own anniversary, and he wants her to come over, and she knows he's there. Now watch Russell's behavior.
Lambert, it's you.
Oh, Suki, you remember me.
Do you remember me?
Oh, do I remember you? Do I remember you?
This is my husband, Russell.
Hello, Russell.
Hello, Lambert.
This is my wife, Julie.
Hello, Suki.
Hello, Julie.
Hello, Julie.
Hello, Russell.
Watch the
This is
name.
my brother, Matt.
Hello, Suki. Hello, Russell.
Hello, Matt.
Hello, Matt.
This is his wife, Prue. She's Julie's sister.
She's not.
Yeah, we're sisters, they're brothers.
They're not.
Hello, Prue.
Hello, Russell. Hello, Prue. Hello, Suki.
Sit down, squeeze in, have a drink. What do you have?
A drop of that red wine will work wonders.
Suki?
You'll have the same.
Are you still obsessed with gardening?
Troll
Me?
Suki.
When I knew him, he was absolutely obsessed with gardening.
Yes, well, I would say I'm still moderately obsessed with gardening.
He likes grass.
That's true, I love grass.
Green grass.
You used to love flowers, didn't you? Do you still love flowers?
He adores flowers. The other day I saw him empty a piss pot into a bowl of lilies.
My dad was a gardener. Not your granddad. No, my dad.
That's right, he was. He was always walking about with a lawnmower.
What, even in the old Kent Road?
He was a man of the soil. How about your granddad?
I never had one.
It's funny that when you knew my husband, you thought he was obsessed with gardening. I always thought he was obsessed with girls' bums.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He was always a keen wobbler.
What do you mean?
So this it's a really fun scene to play because it has a kind of vicious but masked back and forth. And again, this goes to something we've been talking about a great deal in this class about how to play Pinter. When we rehearse this scene, which is deeply uncomfortable because the actors are crammed together in that little banquette, and very drunk, having to pretend to be sort of civil to each other. I did a rehearsal, as Peter Hollow has suggested, of just ripping the mask off and letting them be as blatantly vicious to each other as possible, with Julie pushing Suki out of the banquette and Lambert and Russell going at it. It's also very class-based. They look at Russell and say, "Not your dad wasn't a gardener." And you can tell they're kind of mocking him for his working class background, and Suki for her working class background. And then you put the mask back on and try to think, how civilized you can make things, and still keep that level of aggression and that kind of violent undercurrent as taut as possible. And it gets creepier and creepier. You find out, Julie and Prue, they run charities. Matt is a banker. And then Suki says to them, "What about you two?" Lambert says, "Us two." Suki says, "Yes." "Well," says Lambert, "we're consultants, Matt and me, strategy consultants." And Matt repeats, "strategy consultants." And Lambert says, "It means we don't carry guns." And then they laugh. "We don't have to." And then Matt says, "We're peaceful strategy consultants." Lambert says, "Worldwide, keeping the peace." Wonderful, eh? Yeah, we're really impressive. We need a few of you more about. And now listen to how Russell describes what he knows they do. "We need more people like you, taking responsibility, taking charge, keeping the peace, enforcing peace. We need more like you. I think I'll have a word with my bank." And he goes on like that. And what you realize is the repetition of the word peace and these weapons and the consultants. We don't know exactly what these guys are doing. It could be Bain Capital. It could be McKinsey. It could be any global company that are arms traffickers or oil magnates who are involved in unbelievably corrupt deals with sanctions on avoiding sanctions, rather, of petro billionaires, all the kinds of things that Pinter had started to protest in his life. But what you realize is the language of corporate governance, right, has turned into this masquerade covering what Pinter perceived as a kind of cesspool of evil. We're strategy consultants. We don't carry guns. They don't have to carry guns because they can just do violence around the world, keeping the peace. We need a few more of those, keeping the peace, enforcing the peace. Russell then asks, "How is the strategic consultancy business these days?" Lambert says, "Very good, old boy, very good." And Matt says, "Very good. We're at the receiving end of some of the best tea in China." And so it's all coded behavior of how you make money off other people's suffering and off violence and off terror. Russell is both incredibly jealous of them because he wants to be as equal to them and make as much money as them and impress Suki, and horrified by them and knows exactly what they're talking about. Finally, you get these last two interjections of the waiter. And this one I found so extraordinary. He says, "Do you mind if I make an interjection?" Richard says, "What on earth do you mean?" And he says, "Well, it's just that I heard all these people talking about the Austro-Hungarian Empire a little while ago, and I wondered if they'd ever heard about my grandfather. He was an incredibly close friend of the Archduke." And he goes on to he goes into this situation about the war, which ends with he knew these people, where they were isolated, where they were alone, where they fought against savage and pitiless odds, where they suffered vast wounds to their bodies, their bellies, their legs, their trunks, their eyes, their throats, their breasts, their balls. And finally, Lambert says, well, Richard, what a great dinner. I'm so glad. But it's the echo of war and the violence of trench warfare. And he's saying it to these people who are strategy consultants who are trafficking in guns. And you realize that underneath the veneer, the thin veneer of civilization in this world, is a kind of desperation and violence in which ordinary people have sort of no safety whatsoever. And it ends, I think, incredibly beautifully. If you watch the film, I had a kind of opposite well, yes, of course, sorry, they're saying Lambert and his brother have a definitely English working class accent that seems out of place in this posh restaurant. That's exactly the point. Class is gone, elegance is gone, Oxbridge is gone. They are not Hearst and Spooner anymore. They don't spout poetry. They didn't get an education. These are violent working class people made good. And I think Pinter's point is education doesn't matter at all anymore. Polish doesn't matter anymore. It's simply who's made the most money and who rises to the top of the sort of financial chain. But it ends with the waiter. In the film, it ends with it narrowing down to a very kind of tiny frame. I did the opposite and really opened it out. But I thought it was such a beautiful ending when the waiter says, when I was a boy, my grandfather used to take me to the edge of the cliffs and we'd look out to the sea. And it ends with him saying, my grandfather introduced me to the mystery of life, and I'm still in the middle of it. I can't find the door to get out. My grandfather got out of it. He got right out of it. He left it behind and didn't look back. He got that absolutely right. And I'd like to make one further interjection, and it just gets brighter and brighter. And then it goes to black. And what I think the play is saying is the waiter is always going to be looking for connection. He's always going to be looking for one further moment of human contact in a world of kind of violence and desiccation. Now, when you put that next to the room, it's so fascinating because you're aware in a way that it's the same playwright, but the playwright has moved way up in class, has encountered the moneyed classes, both the literati, which we see in Betrayal, and the banking, the violence of the capitalist class, which we see in this play. But he explained very beautifully how he came to think of this play. And I just wanted to play you that for a moment.
Harold Pinter is here. The New York Times has called him, quote,
The Room. This is the Charlie Rose interview, which I shared with you before.
In short, I was at a party once when I was very young, 25 or something.
Right.
And I was taken to a room. Someone said, you have to meet someone in another room in this house. And I went to this room, and there was a man with bare feet, fluttering around, serving bacon and eggs to an enormous man who was sitting at a table reading a comic, you know?
Yes.
And this fellow turned out Quentin Crisp, and the man fluttering around.
Yeah.
The other man never spoke. And he was talking very
Crisp
talkative.
was the man fluttering around, not the man sitting down being fed
Crisp was
their
the man
eggs.
fluttering around.
Yeah, right.
And he was very talkative and very lively and engaging. But the point was he kept feeding the man, the big man.
Yeah.
And when I left the room after about 10 minutes, this image didn't go away. And finally, a couple of years later, you know, or a year later, my friend Henry Wolfe from Bristol said, I told him about this. And he said, well, why don't you write a play about it? I said, well, I will. I might.
Yeah.
And then he called me and said, where's the play? And I said, what play? And he said, well, you said you were writing a play, and I need it in 2 weeks because I can do it at Bristol, you see.
Yeah.
So I said, out of the question. But then I did write the play in 4 days.
Yeah.
And I changed Quentin Crisp to a woman.
Right.
You know.
It's a woman fluttering around.
A woman.
So that was the original image of the room when Pinter was very young, and he wrote it backstage when he was acting in a Terence Rattigan play. It's absolutely amazing. And he said, I started at the top, and at a certain point there was a knock at the door, and someone came in, and I had absolutely no idea who he was. who he might be or what he might say. I let it run, let it happen. And I found he did have a voice and that he was the landlord. And then 2 visitors arrived and I didn't know what they were on about really, what they wanted, but they were just part of the whole atmosphere. But it worked. It made sense. And Pinter admits he became very excited by the way image could clearly be expressed on stage in theatrical form, not words, one notices, but images, which is significant because nearly all Pinter's subsequent plays were to be triggered by a stored up visual memory. So that's the kind of birth of the room in 1956. It was already completely sui generis. It's amazing that his voice was so unique. The reclusive room, the woman flooding around inside making breakfast, the knock at the door, the themes about naming and hiding, the possibility of Rose's Jewish past, the extreme violence at the end of the play, the woman as caretaker, the standing and sitting and choreography that's going to become so centrally part of Pinter's writing. All of these things were already in there. And when I asked Pinter when we met who Riley was, who is the blind black man at the end of the play, is he a symbol of salvation? Is he a primal force? Pinter said, I think releasing Rose from prison is right, because I said, is that what it's about, the release from her prison? And he said, I thought this was so useful to the playing of the play, but it's an imprisonment she doesn't know she's enduring. And that reminded me of something that he'd said to me about the birthday party, and I held on to all along in directing the play, which was that there's Riley and Bert, that you have to play it absolutely moment to moment to moment, and that very often the most entrapped characters don't realize they're entrapped. We realize it, but they can't play that. They have to play the survival in the moment. So although Rose is in a disastrous marriage to Bert, and it is truly a form of what we would now call domestic terrorism, she can't really know that, right? She is dependent on Bert for her salvation, and she loves him in some way, and she has to try to fight to keep him on her side. And that's why the opening scene is so difficult and so brilliant in a way, and you have to rehearse it meticulously because the timing of how the eggs are fried, how the bacon is made, how she toasts the bread, how she gives it to Bert are choreographed within an inch of his life, just like the pouring of the cornflakes and the fried bread and the tea and all of that is in the birthday party, because it's all part of her survival mechanism, so that she won't get caught. And as soon as Bert leaves, who enters? Mr. Kidd, who is that, for Pinter, archetypal, beautifully observed Jewish character. And although he isn't necessarily named as a Jew, you can feel it the moment he starts to talk, and he gives this classic Pinter monologue. It's amazing that Pinter found that voice, sort of early on in his writing career. There's a sort of Jewish kind of music hall comedy to the whole thing, which is him talking about his sister and the crazy things that happened, and how ultimately he says in this, she says, how many floors do you have? He doesn't even remember how many floors. He says, I used to count them once. He's just like Goldberg, never got tired of it. It's a little bit also like the Caretaker. I used to keep an attack on everything in the house. That's when my sister was alive. But I lost track after she died, which makes no sense. Why does he lose track of the floors after she dies? She's been dead some time now, my sister. It was a good house then. She was a capable woman. Total non sequiturs. Yes, fine size of a woman. I think she took after my mum. Yes, I think she took after my old mum, from what I can recollect. Sounds like Lenny, right, in The Homecoming. I think my mum was a Jewess, he suddenly says. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that she was a Jewess. And then he says, complete non sequitur, she didn't have many babies. And you think, wait a minute. How does he not know who his own mother is? And how come, what does that have to do with not having many babies? But it's kind of classic Pinter. And I don't think actually it's because he has dementia. I don't think Pinter meant that at all. I think we actually all talk in those kind of non sequiturs. Kid only remembers the things about his past, which might be useful. One of the things that's a problem in the play is that he's a landlord and he has neither control over the building nor remembers how many floors he has. He's scared to go in there, just as the brothers are scared to go into the other rooms in the Caretaker. So he's filled with chatter that feels sort of full of kind of non sequiturs, and you think he has some kind of buried past, which may include being a Jewess, and that may include why he's rented the room to Rose, who also may be a Jewess. And they're both terrified because what's happening in the building? A man is in the basement and he won't get out. And that's what we sort of call the emergency of the play. And this is where Pinter had an unerring dramatic nose for kind of theatricality right from the beginning. We have to get that guy out of the basement. As soon as we find out there's somebody in the basement, we want to know who it is and why. Okay, I'm going to leave you with that suspense for 5 minutes. Let's take our break here. It's about 2-ish, and we'll come back at like 2:05. Okay?
Thanks, Professor. Welcome back, everybody. Professor Perloff, go ahead and take it away.
Okay. I just want to finish talking about the room, but I'm mindful of the fact that this is our last class, so I'm more than happy to answer anything you'd like. If you want to put some questions up in the chat, I'm going to leave time at the end. And so anything you want to know or disagree with or query or just talk about, let me know. I just want to finish a little bit on the room, because what I found kind of incredible going back to it after we've been doing this whole class, and in some logical way, I really should have started with the room, is what a precursor the play is to everything that we're going to discover in Pinter. For instance, the way that power and sexuality go together. I'll just give you an example. The way he lifts language and makes you listen in a way that you would never otherwise listen to questions like, Rose is so disturbed and she says to Mr. Kidd, "What did she die? When did she die then, your sister?" And Mr. Kidd says, "Yes, that's right. It was after she died. I must have stopped counting. She used to keep things in very good trim, and I gave her a helping hand. She was very grateful, right into her last. She always used to tell me how much she appreciated all the," and then there's punctuation, "little things," punctuation, "that I used to do for her." You think, what were those little things? Then she copped it, he says. "I was her senior." Does that matter? "Yes, I was her senior." And then he says, "She had a lovely boudoir, a beautiful boudoir." And you think, wait a minute, who would talk about their sister and talk about their sister's boudoir and the sexuality of that and the strangeness of that language? So already Pinter had found those kinds of rhetorical tropes and theatrical devices. When the Mr. and Mrs. Sands come in, it's terrifying because you find out that they were told to come to this room and that this room was vacant. And of course, Rose thinks, no, it's not vacant. This is my room. I live here. I'm about to be evicted. So that constant terror that the central characters in Pinter have, like Stanley, of being about to be evicted from a world that they should belong to, but somehow don't belong to. And you never know who to trust. So when they're talking about the landlord, Miss Rose keeps saying, "Mr. Kidd, that's his name. He's the landlord." And Mr. Sands says, "Who?" And Rose says, "Mr. Kidd." And then there's a pause. And Mr. Sands says, "Is he?" And Mrs. Sands says, "Maybe there are two landlords." So again, that famous Pinter pause where you stop and think, wait a minute, maybe everything we've been told or believe in here is actually wrong. And he isn't the landlord, and it's been a performance. It's just a lie. And, who are we meant to believe? What are we meant to believe? And Rose tries to bring them in and be kind to them and look after them. And instead, it gets more and more frightening the longer that they are in her room until finally, and she keeps chattering on and saying, we're very quiet, we keep to ourselves, I never interfere, right? Why should I interfere? We've got our room, we don't bother anybody, that's the way it should be. So this repeated desperation, using language to keep yourself safe. And then she finds out they've been in the basement. And of course, in some ways, yes, the basement is a metaphor. Yes, it's a metaphor probably for death and for hidden violence, for all the dark things in our lives that we don't want to see, for damp. There wasn't any light. Have you ever been down there? Mr. Sands asked. She says, once a long time ago. And then she says, I was just wondering whether anyone was living down there now. And Mrs. Sands says, yes, a man. Rose says, a man? Yes. One man? Yes, there was a bloke down there, all right. And she's terrified, of course. And you think, why? Why is that so dangerous? What is the problem? And Mrs. Sands finally has this long monologue of looking for a place, and they didn't like the looks of it, and they walked through, and then there was a voice in the basement, and it gave me a bit of a fright, says Mrs. Sands. I don't know about Todd. And of course, Todd, the German word for death. So it's not surprising. And Mr. and Mrs. Sands, it's like sand going through an hourglass. All of these names are really symbolic. But somebody asked if he could do anything for us. So Todd said, we were looking for the landlord. And this man said, the landlord would be upstairs. And then Todd asked if there was a room vacant. And this man, this voice really, I think he was behind the partition, said, yes, there was a room vacant. He was very polite, I thought, but we never saw him. I don't know why they never put a light on. We got out then and we came up and we went to the top of the house. I don't know whether it was the top. There was a door locked, so there might have been another floor. It's just like The Caretaker. You don't know how big the building is. It's like a horror movie. We didn't see anyone. It was dark, and we were just coming down again when you opened your door. And Rose catches them in an inconsistency in their testimony. She says, you said you were going up. What? You said you were going up before. No, we were coming down. The joke's up and down, just like Stanley. You didn't say that before. We've been up. We were coming down. And then Rose says, and it's so moving to me, this man, what was he like? Was he old? We didn't see him. Was he old? And then there's a pause. So you think, why is she asking this? And what does she want to know? And who is the man? And then sure enough, and I will share my screen again just to show you this beautiful picture of Stephen Anthony Jones and Marco Baricelli. In comes a blind man. And Rose is both incredibly rude to him. What are you looking at? You're blind, aren't you? So what are you looking at? What do you think you've gotten here, a little girl? I can keep up with you. I'm one ahead of people like you. Tell me what you want and get out, she says. You know, and she says nasty, racist things to him that are very like what Davies has to say in The Caretaker, which all come out of fear. You know, she says, that's not, he says, my name's Riley. And she says, I don't care if it's, what? That's not your name. That's not your name. You've got a grown-up woman in this room. Do you hear? Or are you deaf now? You're not deaf too, are you? You're all deaf and dumb and blind. A lot of you, a bunch of cripples. What do you know about this room? You know nothing about it. My luck, I got these creeps coming in, smelling up my room. But he does not rise to the bait. He doesn't argue with her. He says, I want to see you. And she's scared of that. And she comes in here and she starts making remarks, as I say, like Davies about these customers and you know, people smelling out rooms and all of that. And finally, he says, I have a message for you. You've got what? How could you have a message for me when I don't know you? And he says, your father wants you to come home. And there's a pause. And she says, home? Yes, home. Go now, come now, it's late, she says to him, and he says, to come home. Stop it, I can't take it. What do you want? What do you want? Come home, Sal. Now, we'll never know what that means, but we do know that Sal was the word that Jews, it's like the name Sarah, and it's the word that Jews had to put on passports, like my mother, when she was in Vienna, when Jews started to be targeted, when you had to put a Jewish star on your passport. and claim that you were Jewish. Men wrote Isaac, women wrote Sarah. So that is a kind of trope of the Holocaust and of the Second World War. What did you call me? She says, come home, Sal. Don't call me that. Come now. Don't call me that. So now you're here, he says, not Sal. And then he says, now I touch you. Don't touch me, Sal. I can't. I want you to come home. No, with me. I can't. I waited to see you. Yes, she says, now I see you. Yes, Sal, not that. So now, it's like a poem, the end. I've been here, she says. He says, yes. Long, yes. The day, look at that image. The day is a hump. I never go out. No, says Riley. I've been here. Come home now, Sal. And there's an incredibly beautiful moment of communion between two human beings. She touches his eyes, the back of his head, and his temples with her hands. So there's this profound communion. And you know what? It doesn't matter what it symbolizes or what it's for. I remember on 9/11 when the audience sat and watched a woman touch a man and just hold his eyes. It was so moving and tender. And then the violence comes in. Bert comes in, he talks about his van, just the way that Mick talked about his van in The Caretaker. A van is always a symbol in Pinter of sexual violence. He describes it as if he has, abused, fucked a woman. I carried her along. She was good. Then I came back. I could see the road all right. He says she went with me. She didn't mix it with me, she being the van. I used my hand like that. I got hold of her. I go where I go. She took me there. She brought me back. I got back all right. So that kind of amazingly violent, male, aggressive, cruel attempt at control. And then he takes the chair from the table, he sits next to Riley, and then he looks at him, and then with his foot, he lifts the armchair up, Riley falls, and Riley says, Mr. Hudd, your wife. Bert says, lice, the way people certainly talk to Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, let's say, we heard that all the time. Bert kicks the Negro's head against the gas stove. Riley lies still. Bert walks away, and there's silence. And Rhodes clutches her own eyes and says, can't see. I can't see. I can't see. Because what Rose does see is that she's married to somebody who's never going to save her. And no matter how she looks after him, he is so imbued with the violence of post-war England that he will never see beyond that. And I think that's something that Pinter deeply recognized. And we do have to remember when this play was written, right? 1956. England is still covered in bombed out sites, rationing, poverty, and the incredibly bitter sense of what happened in the war. And, one of the most heartbreaking things is that it was the British, after all, who were the bravest in the Second World War and fought to defeat Hitler. But after the war, English anti-Semitism gets bigger and bigger. And I don't know if you've been studying this as we've been looking at the crisis in Israel, but it was the British mandate that caused so much of the havoc that we are now seeing in Israel. And the anti-Semitism among the British who were in Palestine at that time was kind of breathtaking in the way that the British exited Palestine, left huge violence in its wake. So I think Pinter was very aware of that. And although the play is a very specific play about one group of people in a specific room, I do think as time has gone on, one could read it as a kind of a play about post-war Britain and the kind of crisis of faith and disaster of post-war Britain, the way that the room makes visible the poverty, the anxiety, the racism of that period, seeing and blindness, the xenophobia, the ways in which when people are oppressed, they start to act out in equally horrifying ways because they feel that they have no recourse. All of that is embedded in the room. And so, the experience of doing that play in conjunction with his newest play was quite unbelievable for me. And I stayed in very close touch with Pinter after that, and I did the homecoming afterwards, which was another opportunity to celebrate his work. But in between those two experiences, Pinter died on December, I believe, 25th or 26th or something like that, 2008. He died. And I'm just going to read you a tiny bit. I wrote the obituary for him in the Chronicle. December 20th, 2008. It was, a terrible time, another terrible time in world history. It was 2008. The global financial crisis had kind of decimated. So many people had lost their homes. I wrote, Pinter died just as all of us in the American theater are wrestling with the role we ought to play in this enormous and difficult new moment in American political history. Having capitulated for years to the crass forces of relevance, this is me talking, and television commercialism in our quest for attention in an increasingly noisy world, the American theater has run out of resources and audiences just at the moment when what we do ought to matter more than ever. It is up to us to assert that the potency of two people in real time in a live encounter on stage can engage us more deeply and fully than all the blogs and special effects in the world. So perhaps the passing of this astonishing writer is the wake-up call we need to dare again, to do work that is fierce and nuanced, that demands imagination and play, that questions the tyranny of political doublespeak, that revels in the virtuosity of great acting, that refuses easy answers and earnest palliatives, but demands that we examine ourselves in all our complexity and mystery. Pinter's is a theater with no agenda other than itself, pure theater, pure experience, caught in the moment of creation. So that may be as good an end as any to this class, to why I love Pinter so much and why it has sustained me for so long in my creative endeavors. And I'm so grateful to all of you that you came on the ride with me. So let me see what you're asking. What am I working on now? I'm about to do, and I'd love you all to come. And of course, I forgot to put it. I'm so sorry. In the wait a minute. I did make a slide for you of this is just some additional reading if you want things to look at. Michael Billington's biography, my book on Pinter and Stoppard, which has a lot of, it looks like this. You can get it anywhere, like at Green Apple Books, and it has a lot of material that we've talked about and a lot on Stoppard. Peter Hall's diaries that I've told you about, this the wonderful Michael Billington biography of Pinter, Mel Gusso's conversations, etc. I forgot to put in the link, but on December 2nd, free at the Legion of Honor, I'm doing the 6th in my series of Greek tragedies. I always do a Greek play for them, a staged reading of a Greek tragedy in conjunction with their Ancient Art Council. And this is Euripides' Ion, which is a play that is never done and nobody knows, but is a really kind of remarkable play with a female heroine. And I just felt at this moment in time, I really wanted to do something about women. And it will actually star an incredible Palestinian Israeli, an actress whose one woman show I did last year in DC, and whose work I really believe in. And in this critical time, I thought this is a great way to support her. And also Nike Amuru, another great actress. Stephen Anthony Jones will be in it. Dan Clegg, who we trained at ACT, will be in it, who used to do a lot of work in our company. So if you come, you'll recognize people. And it's free December 2nd at 2 p.m. at the Legion of Honor. And then I go to New York and I'm teaching at Columbia, their graduate directing program. So interestingly for them, I'm doing Beckett and Pinter. They've never worked on Beckett. The students have never worked on minimalism or on modernism at all, which really surprised me, but they felt that would be really interesting, that they didn't have any experience with that. So I've been going back to a lot, reading Beckett's letters, realizing the incredible relationship that Beckett had to Pinter and also to Stoppard has been very interesting. And then in the summer, I'm going to direct As You Like It down at Shakespeare Santa Cruz. So that's a variety of things. That's in June, and that's at least nearby. So should you want to come and experience some Shakespeare at a company that I really can't praise enough, because in these very difficult times, they have completely sustained a core acting company and beautifully done Shakespeare at a beautiful outdoor grove. They don't spend their lives apologizing and decolonizing Shakespeare. They celebrate it and do it, but at the same time, it's very contemporary and immediate. So I'm very excited to work with them. I don't know when Leopoldstadt will happen in Boston. I will certainly keep you posted. If you want to know what I'm doing, by the way, I have a website, carrieperloff.com, and I update it all the time. So you can always go on and just look on the homepage. It's a little bit of a mess, but you can always look on the upcoming things, and it'll just tell you what I'm working on and how you find out about it, or what I'm teaching. And that'll tell you, what we're trying to figure out about Leopoldstadt is if there's a way to do it without 25 actors. So, Stoppard wrote it for a British company that was enormous. And the question is, can it be made smaller without doing damage to the play? I actually think it can. And I've talked a great deal with Stoppard in the last month about how we might do that. So I'll let you know. But it seems like a number of you would be interested in a Stoppard class. So that might be fun. I'm happy to, let's see, we've done quite a few of his plays over the last few years, maybe something new or broader. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it might also be interesting to, put Stoppard together, with other writers that it's an interesting moment to me, that, and this is what a little bit, I don't want to complain about it, but I do want to talk about it briefly when I do my lecture from Institute on December 2nd. I'm mystified by why, as producers, we used to do so much great classical literature and we have stopped, because some of these plays, I think about Chekhov and climate change, for instance, and the way in which when you read a play like Uncle Vanya, you understand the desiccation of humanity by understanding trees getting cut down and how deforestation is tied to how we see each other as human beings. Chekhov understood that completely. Why don't we do those plays anymore? Why we don't do Genet? Absolutely, female writers, 100%. So right now I'm working a lot with Timberlake Wertenbaker, one of my favorite playwrights ever. She's the one who translated the Greeks that I've been working on, and she and I have been cohorts for a long time, and I've also done many of her plays. I've worked on Carol Churchill, whom I admire enormously, and who at age 85 is continuing to do kind of incredible work in Britain. And there have been so many interesting rediscoveries of female playwrights from times past. As I was looking at Pinter and looking at plays of that era, I started looking earlier at Dawn Powell, who's a writer I love, that people don't really look at and know. It's harder, obviously, in the classical arena, we have to deal with the fact that right up through and including today, even today, only about 25% of produced plays are written by women. But, in earlier eras, there are great plays about women written by, let's say, Ibsen and Strindberg, way more than there are plays. They just didn't get produced. This is, so one has to kind of go and dig around and look. One can find it certainly in the Renaissance, for instance. Aphra Behn was of the same time period as Shakespeare and a great writer. And one company that I would encourage you to go to if you're in New York and you're interested in this, it's called The Mint. And they revive plays that have disappeared, particularly plays by women. And I've seen so many plays there that I thought, how did this, not get produced again? Why does that play not happen? I look a lot at work by people like Ursula Rami-Sarna. There are so many great Irish writers. She's the woman who did A Thousand Splendid Suns for us at ACT, which I commissioned. So I've done a lot of work on Irish women. Marina Carr is another one. For some reason, Ireland has turned up a plethora of great women, which is interesting in a country that until recently was more misogynistic even than the rest of Europe. But sometimes that's why women come to the fore. So you always have to go looking and find things. I think the reason I always go back to the Greeks is we're in a period of war, and a lot of Greek tragedy was written at the height of the Peloponnesian War and tries to wrestle with questions about PTSD and women in war and immigration and violence and polarization and the way in which war makes us more, extreme and excessive even than we've ever been, and really tests leadership. And why is it so hard to find leadership in times of war, which is really what Oedipus is about. So that really interests me. So, it changes all the time. I think the thing I miss about the only thing, I'm so grateful not to be running a theater right now, because it's a really challenging time to keep a theater alive. And all of you whom I bump into at different theaters in town, at SF Playhouse or Aurora or whatever, I salute you. And I've bumped into a lot of you. I bumped into some of you at Aurora at Born with Teeth. I salute you, because the only way to keep theater alive is to keep going as audience members, and to keep urging theaters. I hope Aurora, for instance, used to be a theater that not only did great contemporary work, but really investigated, great plays like The Master Builder of Ibsen, one of my favorite productions Aurora ever did under Barbara Oliver. And sometimes seeing a great classic close up is really thrilling, but they're doing 1984 now, so an important Orwell. But I think that we have to, and I'm aware of that all the time as I look at the current state of war in the world. We have to keep one foot in history, just the way we can't understand what's happening in Ukraine without looking way back at Soviet history and pre-Soviet history, and how Russia evolved the way that it did, and going back to look at Chekhov and Gorky and Gogol and Ostrovsky is really salutary, to say nothing of the fact that half those playwrights are Ukrainian, really. And that's really fascinating. So, I'm always looking. Yes, Bull Rusher, I know. Issa Davis, it's an old play. It was written 20 years ago. It's beautiful. She's an actress and playwright. And the play kind of came back into currency because the wonderful playwright Paula Vogel during COVID did one of the most generous things I've ever seen a playwright do, which is uplift voices of playwrights who don't get produced very often. And one was Issa Davis, and Paula said, this is a play people should know. And I thought that was really wonderful. I don't even get me started about the Strand. It is a great theater. There isn't anything playing. This city has abandoned that theater, and it breaks my heart. I fought very hard with the board of ACT and the whole staff and the community to build the Strand. And at the time, I wasn't sure it was a smart thing to do. And now I think I was an idiot to do it. But Ed Lee was the mayor. I knew that the corner of 7th and Market had been the most dangerous corner in the city for 75 years. And that it's where fenced goods were stolen sold all the time, and drug dealing. And of course, it's only gotten exponentially worse. And, we could talk about this for the next 3 days. Why the city has no will to get drugs off the street, I don't know. But it has really heavily damaged the Strand. It's a wonderful theater. So many people in the community supported it and helped build it. The late, great Nancy Livingston was my board chair and did everything to make it happen. But it's really challenging to program there now because people are really frightened about going. And all we can do is talk to our representatives, if any of you do this, and say it is really important that the Tenderloin get cleaned up. It is the neighborhood with the most children in the city of San Francisco. And it's a neighborhood we used to really have a lot to do with. Teaching children, and the Strand is a wonderful place to bring the neighborhood to come see work and to support people who live in that neighborhood who deserve some beauty and some recognition. So, I remain hopeful that it will come back as a theater, and, hope that you'll all support it and remind the city why it got built. Anyway, I'm so grateful to all of you for being part of this class. I've really loved, hearing all of your questions and seeing how engaged you are. You actually went and read all the plays, which is really moving to me. I know a lot of you went back and looked at the recordings again, which was also really moving to me, and asked questions and all of that. So it's been very heartening and energetic to reconnect with you all. And I know if Pinter were alive, it would make him really proud and happy. So I hope I'll see some of you live, either at, what did you say? Oh, you sent your dentist to Vietcong and she won't give you another cleaning. That's a great story. Theater can always ruffle a lot of feathers. That's a wonderful story. But I hope I'll see you on December 2nd. I hope you keep supporting From, which is a fantastic and really important Bay Area treasure. And that I'll see you at the Fine Arts Museums. Mine is December 2nd. I think my talk is December 4th. I don't know. Alfredo will remind you.
Yeah, December 6th for her talk.
November 6th. And you can always go to my website if you want to reach me or ask anything else. So thank you so much. And thank you again, Alfredo.
Thanks again, Professor Perloff, and thank you, students, for joining us this session.